Welcome to Lighting Up the Shadows podcast. In this podcast, we talk about healing from trauma with the shamanic practice of faith, shadow work, and soul retrieval. I am your host, Brandy Grace, national life coach, trauma survivor, and trauma advocate. I'm here because I want to help you. Hey, this is Brandy Grace. I am so grateful that you are joining me today. This is such an amazing journey. I wanted to start this first podcast out to, one, tell you that I don't edit. Not because I can't, but because I want you to see that I'm an authentic person. And sometimes I stutter, and sometimes I misspoke. All the time. I want you to be able to trust me and know that there's nothing fake or phony here. In the same aspect, I ask that you hold in your heart a place of non-judgment, because we've all been on this crazy journey, and I validate your journey, and I will not judge it, ever. If you ever need to reach out to me and connect, my email is brandygracecoaching@gmail.com, and I'm always happy to hear from my listeners. And my website is brandygrace.lif, because I love life. Alright, to get into the nuts and bolts of what lighting up the shadows is really about, at the core of it, my trauma story was changed by shamanic principles that I didn't know I was implementing my whole life. Shadow work is one of these really great tools that you get from shamanic faith. Now, I'm a Christian, and I'm Celtic, and I'm very spiritual. I practice Tantra for self-love and self-awareness. So if you're like, well, I can't think about and process shamanic stuff because it doesn't correlate to my faith. Well, shamans were in every faith, in every walk of life, in every culture across the world. Shamans were the healers in the communities. Usually they were helping people reconnect to their soul, to bring a centeredness, a wholeness to their bodies. And it's so interesting to me, the study of shamanism, and how at the root of it, it's healing trauma. It works with every divinity style that you have. So again, no judgment. Now, if you already know about shamanism and shadow work, or you've read my book, Lighting Up the Shadows, which is a guided self-journey into trauma healing and recovery, which is on Kindle, and it's also on Amazon, then you'll kind of know my story. I'm a survivor of childhood abuse, neglect, and sexual assault. All before I was 8 years old. And then having a history of abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault as an adult, and going through an adoption story where I'm the birth mom of two amazing adoptive children. They're amazing. I have an autistic daughter, and I'm also autistic. I went through 2 divorces because of domestic violence. I have had so many moments in my life, on my journey, that I thought were the blackest, the darkest. I remember thinking, I could end it all and nobody would miss me. And the only thing that held me and grounded me to this place was my children. That was my hope for the future. And they're all grown and beautiful, amazing children, all in their own right, as they've conquered their own shadows as well. Shadow work is a journey, digging deep and finding out where your triggers come from and learning how to respond according to the triggers and where they come from, and how to process that out to get to that point so that you're not always reacting. A lot of people get stuck in this reaction mode. They get triggered, so they lash out, and then they feel bad, and then because they feel bad because they lashed out, then they get re-triggered, and it's a cycle of drama and self-sabotage and pain. And I'm here to tell you that I broke the cycle. I broke that cycle in my own life of pain, being reactive and impulsive, and making decisions based on emotions. I broke that. And it's through shadow work that I got there. Now, if you haven't read my book and you don't know anything about shadow work, the whole core foundation of it is that there are shadows in between our subconscious that lays deep within our soul, and our conscious, which is how we make decisions every day. Every bit of information that we have that comes in comes through the conscious and goes through filters of our life experiences, which are the shadows. And so as they go through the subconscious and through these shadows, they go through the conscious, through the shadows, and to the subconscious. That's how you react and you respond. Oftentimes, when we have trauma in our history, and we'll talk about deeper levels of trauma, different kinds of trauma, cultural trauma, generational trauma. We'll get to all of that in different podcasts. But the core of it is when you have trauma, your perception, which is the information that you're getting at your subconscious, your perception is altered. When my amazing loving partner told me the other day that the house is feeling cluttered and kind of hoarderish. Well, we live in a tiny house, so that happens quickly. But in that moment, I remembered my mom being a hoarder and how I always struggled to stay away from that and to be a minimalist, and that I didn't want to be like that part of her. I wanted to be like the good parts of her, but not that part. So in that moment, my perception of what he said was that I was a hoarder. That's not his intention. What he said was, it's starting to get cluttery and like a hoarder. It wasn't directed at me, it was directed at the situation. Earlier on in my journey, I would have reacted and picked a fight and yelled and got offended, and our relationship could have been damaged from that interaction. But now, deeper into my journey, I pulled back, I was quiet, I went into myself and said, why does this hurt? Why is this causing me pain? I know that the person it's coming from loves me and has my highest intention. So as I'm processing this in my mind, trying to figure out where it's coming from, where this hurt is coming from, which is how shadow work helps you. It gives you a moment to process and be able to respond and not react. So after a few moments, he noticed my facial expression and knew that there was something that was wrong. But I was able to articulate to him, did you mean that I'm a hoarder? Or did you mean that the house is too cluttered? And he's like, I meant that the house was too cluttered. We've been busy, and I wanted to work on that. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, what is the part of that dialogue that triggered you? And I said, I think it was the word hoarder. I think that's a word that I've tried my whole life to not be. And because we were able to open up communication, my partner was able to articulate and say, okay, well, I'm going to try to refrain from using that word so that it doesn't hurt you. And he said, I don't want to hurt you with any of my words. That's not my intention. Wow. That whole interaction would have been so different in my 20s. I was so reactive. I made so many decisions thinking that I had to make them right then and there. And I always felt like I was making decisions that were the better of two evils. Have you ever been there? When you live a life of trauma, often you get stuck making those decisions based on your gut feeling. We always talk about our gut feeling. I'm going to go with my gut. Well, what happens if that gut feeling is coming from a place of trauma? What happens if that gut feeling is coming from a place of trauma? It's distorted. We have to do the healing work in ourselves to be able to trust our gut. I trusted my gut so often in my 20s and 30s with relationships, friends, romantic, even family. But my gut feelings were often wrong. And I misjudged a situation because I didn't have the tools to understand what was going on. That's why I'm here. I want to share with you the tools. We'll talk a little bit about shamanism. We'll talk a little bit about shadow work, about trauma, about stages of healing trauma, the different kinds of trauma. We're going to hit a lot of stuff, and there might be triggers for you. What I ask for you is to be radically self-responsible. When you feel triggered, which means a trigger is when you feel instantly emotional. You feel this heightened sense of emotion, this heightened sense of anxiety, this heightened senses of awareness where you're just sometimes overwhelmed even. When you're triggered and you feel impulsive and you might want to lash out at someone, I encourage you to dig down deep in yourself and find out, what was it that triggered you? What was it that gave you a reaction? And do you have the ability or the desire to pull back, discover where that's coming from, process the information, and then respond? Even to yourself, respond. Because it's in the response that you're able to heal. Isn't that interesting? Because I found that when I personally, and my clients, when we react from a trigger, then we make really bad decisions. We start arguments, we hurt people, we hurt ourselves. A lot of the self-sabotage that